Hi, thanks so much for having us. It's lovely to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking today about prospective collaborative approaches to meta-analysis. We'll be given an introduction to what a prospective meta-analysis is, talk a little bit about new developments and key interactions with different stakeholders when setting them up. But before we start, we would actually like to hear from you. So we will be using Slido throughout this presentation, and you can use it either by scanning this QR code with your phone or by going to slido.com and entering this number here, so 9000397. And once you're there, you can give us an answer on which area you work in, just so we get a little bit of an idea of who we are talking to today. And also, once you have Slido open, please feel free to leave it open because we'll have new questions pop up throughout this webinar just to make it a little bit more interactive. So I can see the first few of you have started joining here, and we can see you typing, which is great. See some fellow researchers there. Health guidelines, excellent. I think prospective meta-analysis is a really nice evidence synthesis methods to work together with guideline producers, hospital. Excellent. So we see some Australians here. Thanks for joining us quite late. It's dinner time, I reckon. So nice to see you there. Excellent. Perfect. Music therapy. Wow, that's cool. Okay. Thanks. I think that gives us a nice little overview, and we'll try to adjust our talk a little bit to all of that. So let me start by taking you back to a place maybe not too many of you want to go back to, and that's the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. So at the start of COVID-19, we saw many new trials emerge at unprecedented speed. So you can see here on the x-axis the month, and on the y-axis, you can see the number of trials registered on COVID-19. And you can see really, really quickly more and more trials until at the peak, we had about 300 new trials a week. Now, this is great. Researchers addressing a health problem that's rapidly emerging. However, many of these trials were actually underpowered to detect differences in important clinical outcomes. So here on the left-hand side, you can see the target sample sizes these trials had. So most of them by treatment area, most of them were in about between 100 and 300. However, on the right-hand side, you see some power calculations of how much sample size would have been needed to be able to detect differences in arguably the most important outcome, mortality. So these are in the thousands. And if we wanted to understand differences for different subgroups, even in the 10,000s. So a major problem here. Now, luckily, many trials were addressing the same research question. So the solution of using systematic reviews and meta-analyses may seem obvious to you. You can see here around 200 trials or over 100 here addressing those treatments. Now, I would make the argument that the solution, in fact, would be collaborating through prospective meta-analysis and individual participant data. So again, on the left-hand side here, you can see the number of participants per treatment. And on the right-hand side, you'd see what happened if instead of looking at the median recruitment target, we looked at the total number of targeted patients per treatment across the trials by May 2020. So here suddenly we have 100,000 of patients for some treatments. Now, you may ask yourself, why can't we wait? Why can't we wait for each trial to publish their results and then combine them in a traditional systematic review and aggregate data meta-analysis? And if you're asking yourself that question, you've come to the right place because that's what we're aiming to answer in this presentation. We'll talk about problems with traditional systematic reviews and how these can be overcome using collaborative evidence synthesis and, in particular, prospective meta-analysis. Now, systematic reviews are widely seen as at the top of the evidence hierarchy. They're widely used to inform healthcare policy and practice. However, there are several limitations and potential sources of bias. So, what are the problems with traditional evidence synthesis? First of all, we have publication and selective outcome reporting bias. only about half of all studies are published. And this does not only lead to unavailability of results, it also leads to biased results. And that can be seen in this graphic. So if you imagine a full study cohort, and the green trials are the positive ones that show an effect, and the red are ones that show no effect. This is what the study cohort may look like. By the time publication biases hit, mainly the studies that were positive will have been published. So you already have a biased representation here. Now, selective outcome reporting describes the phenomenon that trials only report about half their outcomes. And again, they're more likely to report on the positive results. So suddenly we have a subset here in the literature that looks mostly green, even though we had a half-half situation here in reality. Another limitation of traditional systematic reviews relates to the retrospective inclusion of studies. So most of the time we're experts in the area that we're doing systematic reviews and meta-analysis on. And that means we possibly already know about the most important studies out there. And that may conflict, consciously or unconsciously, how we set our research question and our eligibility criteria. And I think this becomes very clear in Julie's daughter's example, who knew that she had failed history when she decided to exclude any minor subjects from her evidence synthesis, concluding that she was a straight A student. Another problem that you're possibly all very aware and familiar with if you've conducted systematic reviews and meta-analyses is that too often we're trying to compare pears with apples. So we have studies. So I think you all know the frustrating example of when you have identified 20 studies addressing your research question, but maybe only 3 or 4 collect the primary outcome in a way that you can actually use them for your evidence synthesis. Now we have trials looking at different populations, different outcomes, different measures, different time points, or they use different analyses. And to just get us back to our COVID-19 example, we looked at trials conducted in Australia at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and which of these collected these 5 core outcomes. And you can see red is the ones that did not collect them. So most of them did not collect most of the core outcomes. And shockingly, only about half of them even looked at mortality, likely because they were too small and underpowered to detect differences themselves. And that led to headlines such as this one: little gains as millions spent on virus studies. Now, this is major research waste, and unfortunately, COVID-19 is just one striking example, but we know that this also happens in different research areas. So there's 2008, Chalmers and Glasgow estimated that about 80% of research is wasted. And whilst this has got a little bit better, we still have way too much research waste across research areas. Now, how do we reduce research waste and maximize the value of research? Kylie, what do you think?
Good question, Lena. Hi. So funnily enough, the answer is, of course, prospective meta-analysis. And the eminent researcher John Ioannidis has gone so far as to say that all primary original research may be designed, executed, and interpreted as prospective meta-analysis. And I tend to agree. So I think next up we have another Slido. We just want to know what your experience is with prospective meta-analysis, or PMA, if any. So if you go back to that poll and let us know, that would be great. Thank you. What's a PMA? Okay. Okay, well, this is good. So most of you are not sure what it is. You've come to the right place, because I will be answering that question very shortly. And no one here has done one yet, but hopefully we can change that. So what is a prospective meta-analysis, or PMA? It's when studies are identified as eligible for inclusion in the meta-analyses, and hypotheses and analysis strategies are specified before the results of the studies or cohorts related to the PMA research question are known. So the key thing is here, studies are included before their results are known. So if you look at the figure here, you can see the PMA cutoff is right before analysis starts. So trials can join a PMA at any point up until then. Ideally, you do what we've coined a de novo PMA, where trials all agree to collaborate in the planning stage, because obviously that gives you much more capacity to harmonize your protocols. But again, it doesn't matter. PMA can still happen when trials are already underway or collecting data. So there's several other types of emerging prospective meta-analysis type approaches. And this is a sneak peek from something from the updated Cochrane Handbook chapter, which will be published very soon. So prospective meta-analysis is the one I've just spoken about. Typically, that would use individual participant data. FAME is a similar approach that uses aggregate data and identifies the earliest possible timing for reliable evidence based on accumulating data. A nested meta-analysis is when you have newly emerging evidence, but you also have published previous evidence. And so you can combine these to include both completed and ongoing studies. All in is a prospective cumulative meta-analysis, so it links PMA methods, but also with living systematic reviews. And collaborative network trials are sort of similar to multi-center trials, but they're independent, but they share a harmonized protocol and expertise and infrastructure. So, back in 2019 now, we published this research methods and reporting paper in the British Medical Journal. And because there wasn't really any guidance on how to conduct a prospective meta-analysis. So we developed this guidance, led by Lena, Professor Seidler, based on a scoping review of methodology papers, existing PMAs, our experiences with previous PMA, but also as together with the Cochrane Methods Prospective Meta-Analysis Group, which we've been a part of for some time. And this paper goes through step-by-step guidance on how to conduct a prospective meta-analysis. And we will talk through these with a particular focus on the key differences to a traditional systematic review and meta-analysis. But first, we've got some case studies that I was going to briefly introduce. So there's 4 here that we're going to refer back to. The first one, I think on the next slide, is the early prevention of obesity in children collaboration. And this one formed back in 2009, actually, when the researchers all happened to be at a conference together and realized they were doing very similar trials and very cleverly decided, let's collaborate. And they wrote a combined protocol in 2010, conducted their trials, and then published results at 2 years and up to 5 years as well. And that some of the trials were able to get funding contingent on being part of the PMA because it meant that they had sufficient sample size to address the key questions. The next case study is Top Child. So this is an individual participant data meta-analysis. And in this example, we had a nested prospective meta-analysis. So there was already existing evidence on behavioural interventions for the prevention of obesity in children. But there was also a lot of newly emerging trials. So we were able to combine both this retrospective and prospective evidence to conduct this meta-analysis, which was published in The Lancet last year. Our next case study is ICOM. This was led by Lena, and this was looking at umbilical cord clamping management at preterm birth, also published in The Lancet, and we'll be talking a bit more about that shortly as well. And then lastly, we had Spark. This is an ongoing meta-analysis that we are advising on, prospective meta-analysis, looking at interventions for the prevention of youth e-cigarette use. And this will intend to be a living review as well. So, we will jump back to these, but for now, we are going to go through the step-by-step guide to prospective meta-analysis based on this BMJ paper we published, but also the, as I mentioned, the soon to be published handbook chapter update for Cochrane. So I think this is over to you now, Lena.
I think
Yes.
so too, yes. A really important step before you conduct the PMA is deciding whether a prospective meta-analysis is even right for your research question. And here we'd like to hear from you again. What kind of circumstances do you think are right to perform a prospective meta-analysis? What kind of research questions should prospective meta-analysis be considered for? So I'd really appreciate if you went back to your Slido, had a think, how to think, and when would you want to prospectively combine evidence? And I'll give you all a moment to think about this. So here it says intervention clinical trials. Um, that's an interesting one. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So RCTs is certainly what this is quite often used for because it's a bit easier to identify them prospectively through trial registrations. However, there's also some very successful prospective meta-analysis that are not for clinical trials. So this is, whilst it's often used for this case, it's also possible for other um, when several trials are happening in the same time frame, that's a really important one, of course. You can't really prospectively coordinate research if it's not happening somewhat at a similar time. You also don't really want to run a prospective meta-analysis project for 20 years while you wait for different trials to happen. Yes, so when you need a large population, I think that's important, particularly maybe we have really serious but rare events that we're interested in innovative treatment under conditions, exactly. So it's kind of this something new is happening. There's not so much retrospective evidence. Pandemic, yes. I think luckily someone here has listened to our first example. Thanks for that. I think this is obviously a really important research question. Lots of research happening at the same time. When you need it urgently, that's an interesting one because we do have to wait a bit for prospective meta-analysis. So but of course, if there's only evidence that's still emerging, that's the most urgent we can do. And equity questions, I think, again, this is a nice one where we can address these kind of subgroups because we can agree to look at them prospectively. Excellent. I think these are some really good answers. Maybe we can stop talking now, Kylie, because people have already understood it all. Okay, I'll still walk you through my next slide. So deciding if a prospective meta-analysis is the right methodology. So as you've all pointed out, prospective meta-analysis should be considered for high priority research questions. So this is quite a resource intensive undertaking. So you want to do it when you really think you can give an important answer here. When there's limited previous evidence, just because otherwise you may want to decide to do a retrospective meta-analysis. And really importantly, new studies are expected to emerge within a reasonable time frame. Now, this is a graph kind of showing you a decision graph on whether you should do a prospective meta-analysis. And again, I think this is the question of high priority is a really important question here that you've all pointed out as well. Now, one thing I wanted to point you at, and I'll show that to you in the next slide, is what do we do if there already is quite a bit of retrospective evidence, but also there's a lot of ongoing important evidence emerging. And in that case, you may want to consider what we call a nested prospective meta-analysis. Now, this is now here we combine the retrospective evidence with prospective studies and try to prospectively harmonize studies to have the right outcomes, to match the retrospective evidence. And one really nice thing here is that we can also then compare the prospective and retrospective evidence in sensitivity analysis to check for potential bias. Now, the next step, once you've decided, yes, the prospective meta-analysis is the right method for me, really important in prospective meta-analysis is a protocol. And this is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about and explaining in the forthcoming Cochrane Handbook chapter. So hopefully that should be available for you soon as well. So there's quite a few additional items that really need to be pre-specified in a prospective meta-analysis. One really important point is how are you going to search for planned ongoing studies? You may already want to include a list of the included studies, again, to minimize this bias by retrospective selection. You want to think about which data will you collect and how. So this is really important then to pre-specify that level of harmonization to make sure studies are aligned enough. Um, you want to pre-specify your statistical analysis. You may want to think about some power calculations, again, to make sure that your analysis are going to be worthwhile. It's only really worth doing if you will have enough evidence forthcoming. And you may want to think about when is that cut point? What is a high enough sample size to trigger analysis? You also may want to think about what about future updates of the prospective meta-analysis and how are you going to manage your collaboration of trialists and the publication? So how do we search?
So,
Sorry.
oh,
Kylie, how do we search for studies?
so as Lena mentioned, it's a key step, obviously, of all systematic reviews, but in particular for PMA, we are looking for planned and ongoing studies. So a key resource for identifying these is clinical trials registries. So it's really important to search these. You can also search for published protocols and cohort descriptions, and approaching relevant stakeholders. But as I mentioned before, one PMA we were involved in came out of a conference where people realized they were conducting the similar trials. So it's also really important just consulting with your networks as well. And there is guidance available on searching clinical trials registers step by step. I won't take you through this now, but just to show there's a table here that highlights key differences between searching your traditional like publication Medline databases and your clinical trials registries. So do check that out when you have a moment. Um, Oh, and so yeah, as I mentioned before, it is a key way to do this is also approaching relevant stakeholders. So PMA can really be a catalyst for initiating a program of priority research. And it can be similar to a multinational, multi-center trial. However, a key difference is that individual trials can have some flexibility with their protocols if they want to answer some sort of context or location specific questions. So that's also an advantage there. Oh, you're on mute, Lena.
Oh, that's a problem. So once you've found the eligible studies, it's time to grow your collaboration. And that's a really key difference to how we run our meta-analyses, that instead of looking through papers, we're actually talking to people a lot. So these are just some examples of what our previous prospective meta-analysis collaborations looked like. So talking to each other, making agreements together, getting people involved in writing the protocols and asking the research question, interpreting the evidence, but importantly, then also disseminating the evidence to local guideline groups is a really important part and can be a really important strength of a prospective meta-analysis. And it can be a lot of fun. So now we have another slider for you because we'd like to hear from you. What is important, do you think, to successfully manage a prospective meta-analysis collaboration? Funding and resources. Someone's very programmatic here, but yes, it does take time and energy, and so you need to think about how you're going to resource that. Clear protocols, leadership and communication. Yes, yeah, I think being pleasant to each other. Um, I think communication is key. Excellent. Right. Clear role definitions, that's an important one, having a clear objective. Um, Excellent. Let me then maybe show you how we like to organize our prospective meta-analyses. So as many of you have pointed out, it is really important to have a clear governance structure and governance plan. So we usually write a governance plan quite early on, where we clarify all these questions around what is the collaboration structure, what are people's responsibilities, what are meeting frequencies, what will our data sharing process look like, who qualifies for authorship and how, and so on. And usually we have a structure that looks a bit like this, that we have a steering group that's really conducting the project and is responsible for the day-to-day conduct. We have an advisory group out of senior international advisors in different areas, so clinicians, methodologists, policymakers. We also like to include patient representatives where possible in this advisory group. And then we have, of course, very importantly, the trial representatives.
So, as Lena has alluded to before, a key strength of PMA is that you can harmonize common core protocol variables. So, rather than trying to compare apples and pears, we can get two apples to compare. So, yeah, recently we've with our top child PMA that I mentioned earlier, that's obesity prevention, the outcomes have been collected in a very heterogeneous way. So there's diet, physical activity, as you can imagine, there's a lot of different ways to assess these things, a lot of different questionnaires, and it can be quite frustrating when the data can't be used or synthesized. So this is a key strength of PMA. It also enables collection of rare adverse side effects. So a single trial alone may not have the power, but combining it is a great way to be able to assess these things. And as I mentioned, harmonization, you don't need exactly the same protocol. You pre-specify some core outcomes and importantly, how they are assessed. And we've got the comment initiative here, which has a database of core outcome sets for specific fields of medicine. So that's a great place to start. So yeah, you can agree on your core outcomes and then collect some trial specific ones as well. So an example of this, back to our EPOC example in early obesity prevention. So before the trials had agreed to participate in the PMA, so in this table on the left, over 50% of the outcome categories were included in only one or two trials. However, after the PMA plan was planned, all but one of the outcome categories was included in all trials. So we have in the figure on the right, before PMA inclusion, we had 18% of core outcomes collected by all trials. And after PMA inclusion, this went up to 91%. So really, enhanced the power of these outcomes and our ability to synthesize them. And so the ability to harmonize does depend on which stage the studies are included. So in the top example there, we've mentioned the de novo PMA. So when you're at the planning stages, it can be much easier, as I said, to harmonize core protocol elements. When the trials are underway, it can be a bit more difficult, but with the EPOC example, we were able to add new outcomes during this stage. At the data collection, it's a little bit more difficult, but there is still some things that can be done. So I guess the message is try and collaborate as early as possible, but it is still possible to do a PMA when trials are at different stages. So this is going back to our top chart example. So we did have quite an extensive harmonization process, which we've just drafted a methods paper on, so hopefully that will be out soon. We did retrospective harmonization based on, we did a data mapping exercise, and we actually had workshops to see, well, are variables equivalent? Can they be harmonized? But also we had prospective harmonization where we pre-specified some core outcomes and measures, and we provide these to planned or ongoing trials and encourage them to collect these where possible. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I guess it's just emphasizing, harmonization can occur at many different levels. And ideally, we want to be as specific as possible if we can. So this example here, for instance, you can say, well, people should collect, or trials should collect information about child sleep. And that's the general outcome category. But then, of course, there can be different measures within this category. So you can have sleep duration, location, or quality. And then specific tools used to measure these outcomes can be different. So sleep might be measured using an accelerometer or study specific questionnaires. So it's ideal if you can specify the measure as well. And lastly, also the method of aggregation. So it's not just about specifying the outcome category, but trying to be as detailed as possible to really make synthesis easier or possible. And also a key point is to not just agree on outcomes, but also key demographic variables. So that's particularly important to enable us to look at equity considerations. And these are collected quite heterogeneously often. And I think I may let Lena speak to this because you're doing a bit of work on this at the moment. Did you want to? I'll put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I suppose, and we saw that come up in what should prospective meta-analysis be used for? Someone said equity. I think we have the problem that very often in trials, equity variables are not measured, not reported, or measured in such different ways that we really struggle to answer these equity questions when we try to bring together the evidence. And prospective meta-analysis and also individual participant data really enable us to address that from the start, to ask ourselves what are key demographic variables that we should collect, that we may see effect differences in that may be important here, what may work and for whom, and then we can collect and systematically test for that. And since I'm already talking, I may also continue here to walk you through steps 6 and 7. You can see we're almost at the end of our prospective meta-analysis steps. So yay, thanks for sticking with us. So here it's all about evidence synthesis and assessing certainty of evidence. This is actually quite similar to what you would do in a retrospective meta-analysis. However, it should be much easier because you've pre-specified and harmonized things in advance. So ideally, this synthesis process will go quite smoothly. And here you also have the decision to make. Well, ideally, you've already made that in the protocol stage, but you have to execute the decision of whether you're using individual participant data or aggregate data. Now, many prospective meta-analysis use IPD, individual participant data, just because it's another collaborative method. And if you already decide to collaborate that early on, you may as well also share data and get the most of it and work together to set up prospective data sharing agreements. But there is both. So there's prospective meta-analysis of aggregate data and of IPD. You may ask yourself, what is she talking about? What is individual participant data? So let me just briefly talk to you about that. So an individual participant data meta-analysis involves the central collection of raw data for each participant in the original trials. So it's really a data set, like you can see here on the right side, with a row for each participant. And an IPD meta-analysis has many advantages. They're regarded as the gold standard for meta-analysis. And you can see here in these diagrams on the left-hand side, you have an aggregate data meta-analysis, lots of really colorful participants, and distilled into publications. And all you can scrape from the publications is the gray average effect estimate. Whereas on the right-hand side, you have an IPD meta-analysis that retains all the different colors and all the different participants and enables much richer analysis, including, for example, whether an intervention works better for the red participants than the blue ones. So again, it enables us to better assess equity questions. Another nice feature of IPD meta-analysis is that we can also include unpublished studies and outcomes. So, for example, in the ICOM case study, we were able to include an additional 30% of data that wasn't published because people provided us with unpublished studies or unpublished outcomes. And that can give us less bias and more precise effect estimates. Now, a few considerations for IPD in a prospective meta-analysis framework. As I've already said, they're both collaborative evidence synthesis approaches, so it kind of makes sense if you already have a collaboration, you may as well use both of these methods. They also share some key features. So they both have improved harmonization and they both have this really important component of good communication and collaboration management. And for that reason, they often go hand in hand. However, IPD meta-analysis, we've recently looked at IPD meta-analysis of RCTs published, and we can see here they are increasing over time, and currently about 13% of them are also prospective. Now, just a little bit of advertisement here. We've developed a lot of methods for IPD meta-analyses, and other people like Richard Riley here have too. So there's a lot of really good guidance out there on how to really get the most out of your IPD. So feel free to check out this great handbook by Richard Riley or some of our publications if you're interested in this. However, we'd like to go into detail for one stormy side quest of IPD meta-analyses, and I will hand over to Kylie to cover that.
Thanks, Lena. Yeah, I think it's kind of difficult to avoid this topic. So we are in a bit of an integrity crisis in medical research. So if you want to go next slide, Lena. Every day, there's new cases of research misconduct, fraudulent papers, and so on. And so there's really an issue with how do we know if we can trust the trials that we want to include in our meta-analyses. And experts have, suggested that maybe 1 in 5 or up to 20% of papers are based on affected by research misconduct. So if we jump ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. So really having individual participant data enables us to detect these integrity issues. So in this instance here, we have John Carlisle, the editor of the journal Anesthesia. He looked at some trials that did not have raw data available and concluded that almost all of them seemed trustworthy. But when he was able to access raw data, this dramatically changed, and up to 40% of trials contained flawed or fatally flawed data. So having IPD can really help to detect these trustworthiness issues that can then be filtered out of the evidence base to ensure that we're only basing it on real evidence, real studies. So to address this, we developed the individual participant data integrity tool. So this includes checks at both the summary aggregate data level, but also at the level of individual participant data. And we encourage you to check out these papers if you can, and incorporate integrity checks into your meta-analyses workflows. And Lena, should research end with publication?
No.
What a surprise.
What a surprise. So yeah, back to our last step. Here we end with publication, but we don't believe research actually should end that way. And I think we saw some of you here in the audience are actually guideline developers. So that's great to see. We very much believe that we should always think about how research can be used next. And collaborative evidence synthesis, so both prospective meta-analysis and individual participant data meta-analysis, allow a rapid translation of results into guidelines and practice. So just to give you one example, usually we see research to practice gaps of 17 years. Now, when we found in the ICOM collaboration that deferring cord clamping, so waiting to clamp the cord, can save the lives of babies, we did not want to wait that long. So what we did is we thought about implementation from the start. We defined our target group and involved them in our collaboration from the start. And that meant that we were able to enable really rapid implementation. So we had the input of the international guideline groups who would address their research questions directly in the protocol, and then we shared our results with them before they were even published. And that meant that the new treatment recommendations by ILCOR were able to be released almost at the same time as the publication of our main results here, which was really lovely to see. Now, I just wanted to mention to you the great development process, which can be used to work with guideline groups to develop such collaborative evidence synthesis directly into guidelines. So what do you need to do if you want to think about implementation from the start? You really need to map out your stakeholders early on. You need to invite consumers and relevant stakeholders into your advisory group or consortium. You also importantly need to budget for this. So this takes time, additional time to your core research project. And you can leverage your collaborative network. So one of the really cool things about these big collaborative projects is that you have a lot of the international experts that have their national connections to their guideline groups or policymakers. So if you work with them from the start, they may also then help you to implement the findings in their local contexts. One really nice example of how implementation was thought about from the start comes by the SPARC collaboration, which really thought about this as a living evidence surveillance system. So they combined a lot of approaches that we presented today. They search clinical trial registries, they include unpublished information, they coordinate and collaborate with any trials they find, but then they also work with policymakers and decision makers throughout this process to bring any evidence they find straight into policy and practice.
So that brings us to our summary of, so these are our collaborative evidence synthesis lessons that we hope you'll take away from today. First of all, collaborate and coordinate. So look for who else is doing similar research, who can I collaborate with, and a great way to identify these trials is to search clinical trials registries. Also really important to harmonize core protocol elements and measures where possible. So the earlier you collaborate, the easier it is to be able to do this. And again, look for core outcome sets on the COMET database as well. And then, as Lena's just spoken about, really important to plan for implementation from the start to make sure that your research has real impact. And Lena, is this still...
Yes, this is
Yes.
so. You may be shocked now because you see there's a great call for special issue and you have a great idea, but the deadline has just passed. Well, I can tell you we were able to extend it a little bit until the 1st of June. So this is a call for papers. If you have any ideas, please get in touch. We're editing a special issue here for Cochrane Evidence Synthesis Methods. Or if you're just more interested in this, please follow this special issue closely because we have a lot of really great papers in the pipeline that will be published here soon. And that gets us to the end of our talk today. We're really looking forward to questions. Thank you for participating. Thanks for all